My name is Marina Henke. I'm a professor at the Hertie School, and I'm delighted to host today's event, The Value of Grand Strategy for Germany. This event is funded by the German Academic Exchange Service, or the DAAD, and is a co-production of the Kissinger Center at SAIS Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C., and the Hertie Center for International Security. And this event will be recorded, so watch out. But only the part where the speakers actually present their points. During the Q&A, we will cut off, but then it will be put on YouTube and made widely available on the DAAD website and also on the Hertie Center for Security website and also on the Kissinger Center website. So in June 2023, Germany released its first ever national security strategy. And the document was meant to codify Germany's Zeitenwende, including many of the security policy and doctrine changes that Germany would undertake in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And let me tell you, Germany learned during the process that writing strategy is really hard. The strategy has some fans, but also a lot of critics. And now, the question, of course, is very often raised. What is the value in the end of grand strategy or such a grand strategic document for Germany going forward? Should this exercise be repeated? There are all sorts of noises and sounds by the incoming new government that they also want to write a new national security strategy. But then the question arises, should they start from scratch or should they use bits and pieces of the document that was published in 2023? And two of our panelists today, Dörfler and Holger Janusch, both professors at the German Federal University of Applied Administrative Sciences here in Berlin, have worked on the most thorough study of Germany's first national security strategy, analyzing, among others, what key ideas influenced the German strategy development process, how the process was structured, and also what first lessons can be drawn from the strategy's writing and implementation and processes. Two other of our panelists, Kristina Spohr and Frank Gavin, are world-renowned experts on German grand strategic thinking. Kristina is a professor of international history at the London School of Economics and author, among others, of Post-Wall, Post-Square, or in German, Wendezeit, which was named the best political science book in Germany in 2020 and which analyzes first Germany's completion of the first grand strategic goal, if you want, German reunification, but also describes this kind of vacuum, this gap in grand strategic thinking that opened up in Germany in the early 1990s once German reunification had actually occurred. And the second book, which I also greatly admire, is called The Global Chancellor, a book on the German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, which I think was actually the best grand strategic thinker in post-war Germany, but arguably that's debatable. But certainly he was one of the great strategic thinkers Germany has produced ever since 1945. And then we have Frank Gavin, the Giovanni Agnelli Distinguished Professor and Director of the Henrik Kissinger Center at SAIS Johns Hopkins. Among his many, many achievements are his two groundbreaking books, which also deal with German grand strategy. Also, it's not mentioned directly in the title of the book, but in the first book he wrote, Gold, Dollars, and Power, The Politics of International Monetary Relations, 1958 to 1971, Germany plays a major role in the ways of how Germany yields its financial power and its economic power after the Wirtschaftswunder. And in his other book, Nuclear Statecraft, History and Strategy in America's Atomic Age, Germany plays a very important role, and especially its nuclear ambitions and how America dealt with it. Both of them will analyze and help us understand how German strategic thinking and strategy development has evolved ever since 1945, how successful it was, and how it contrasts to the strategy that was developed more recently and that Thomas and Holger will explain to us. So the event today will start with Thomas and then Holger, and then we will move over to Kristina and then Frank. And then I have a couple questions for you, and then we'll open up for Q&A very quickly. So let's give our famed panelists a very warm welcome.
Okay. It's on. Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thanks a lot for the invitation, for organizing the last 2 days, which have been fascinating, and for organizing this public event. It's great to be here. So thanks a lot for pulling this off. I'd like to start the conversation by again repeating that Holger and I we did the first comprehensive academic review of the German national security strategy. It's going to be published next month. It's going to be open access in the German Zeitschrift für Politik as a special issue, and it brings together 16 written contributions by 19 authors who dealt with various from various perspectives with the written product of the national security strategy, looking from the perspective of political science, public administration, but also we have legal scholars involved, looking at the functions of the strategy, the policy areas, robustness, resilience, sustainability, and the institutionalization of the strategy. And we hope that this volume will be a start of the academic and public debate on the future of the German national security strategy. To start with, I think the intention of the authors of the strategy was to actually write a strategy. So to write a strategy in the ends, ways, means kind of logic of how to write a security strategy. And this is also, I think, reflected in the structure of the document, defining goals, assessing the threats, and detailing a long list of means. Having said that, I want to share some key results of our volume, and while there are some good things that can be said about the strategy. For instance, one of the most important lines is the one on Russia, that is for the time to come, the biggest threat to Euro-Atlantic security. Of course, we were focusing a lot on the shortcomings of the strategy, and I'd like to highlight 3 particular shortcomings regarding the ends, the means, and the overall strategic logic. Looking at the ends, what we find, several of our chapters find, that there's a missing prioritization and a certain ambivalence regarding the goals. So there's a long list of goals that are in the strategy that are. Some of them are kind of vague, such as fostering peace and security, or securing access to water and people's health. And that makes, of course, implementation difficult, and prioritization is missing here. The strategy also doesn't really address the trade-offs between different goals. So which of the goals are the priorities, and what does that mean then for the other goals? We also find that there is an insufficient threat assessment. There's a chapter on that that I authored in the volume. While the strategy identifies a number of threats, I think what is missing is a deeper understanding of where these threats are coming from, what the interactions are between the threats that are identified, and how those threats are then connected with the means to address. So for instance, we have Iran and North Korea identified as a threat, but then we don't find any means that address those threats in the strategy. Which brings me to the ways and means. These are actually the longest, the most detailed parts of the strategy, and we find really long lists of already existing programs that have been listed in the strategy. For instance, there's a very detailed part on defense, where the strategy lists a lot of things that already are happening. And one of the chapters is dealing with the question of why there is actually so little innovation in this particular part of the strategy. And what we also find other chapters is that on top of the long list of means, we we find very little on how those means are going to be used, in what kind of combination. Are they integrated? Are they sequentially used? And all these sorts of things. Which brings me to my third point, the overall strategic logic, and what we try to do with our sort of research focus on the strategy is to think, what can research actually bring, get us when we formulate security strategies. And what we find, looking at particular definitions of key terms that are used in the strategies, that they're either often used too narrowly or too broadly. To make a couple of examples, the term resilience is very important in the strategy, but it's just used in a way that we want to be ready to absorb a certain shock in terms of like supply chains, for instance. But what is missing is thinking about how we could actually adapt or transform our societies to become more resilient. So not just look at the shock absorption, but also more the adaptation. Deterrence is another key term that is used, and that is only used, again, very narrowly in the sense of military deterrence. But the strategy spans very few lines on economic deterrence, so how economic statecraft could be used as a form of deterring our the threats that are identified. Or another example would be democracy, where again we find a very broad definition of democracy. One of the chapters that deals with the concept of militant democracy as it's used in the strategy. And the author, Henrik finds that with the securitization view that the referent object is very broadly defined, so not just democracy in the sense of the functioning of democratic institutions, but also more general cultural norms of German society, the stability of German society. Again, the threat is also very broadly defined in terms of classical forms of radicalization, extremism, new forms of extremism, external actors that are so threatening democracy. And again, the means to address those are also very broad, from education, political education, to classical forms of policing. And that's, I think, where our sort of, where the merit of our work comes in, is that we can use political science concepts to make sense of how they are used in the strategy and think about how they should be used in a better way.
So thank you very much for having me, Marina. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think Thomas already said everything I know about this security strategy. So let me maybe start with an obvious but still important point. Having a grand strategy does not guarantee better results. So it's simple, but it's important. It's not a cure for all the security illnesses of Germany or Europe. So often we think, okay, grand strategy is just a list of end, ways, and means, but usually it's more. It's an intellectual framework, a state theory, to quote Barry Posen or Hall Brandt's two famous grand strategy scholars. So if a grand strategy is a theory, it can be based on wrong assumptions, incorrect hypotheses, or misleading empirical evidence, and then it can be ineffective or even counterproductive. So we have to always be aware there are not only risks without strategy, but also risks from strategy. So now let's have a look on Germany and the future of German security. So Germany is right now in a process I would call of strategic reconstruction. So the new coalition agreed to create a National Security Council, which will be responsible for the next German security strategy. So this new government has now a unique opportunity to create something really which set the path for an effective security strategy development that can contribute fundamentally to the German and European security. However, this opportunity comes also with a downside that any institutional shortcomings might lead to lasting negative effects for German security. So my goal in the next 4 or 5 minutes is not to assess the pros or cons of the National Security Council, but to point out aspects that should be considered when designing the next National Security Council with regard to strategy development. So from my perspective, it's really important to consider that a national security strategy has several important central functions. So depending on which functions take center stage for the next government, the personnel, institutional, budgetary requirements for the National Security Council may differ or change depending on the circumstances. In the introduction of our special issue, we kind of introduced or summarized 7 central functions of a national security strategy, and I want to now group them into 3 arguments. So my first argument is that when thinking about a national security strategy, most scholars or practitioners think about a written strategic document that defines the ways and means that will be used to achieve specific ends. So if the central function of a security strategy is to provide such a strategic guide or concept, research on foreign policy making or in specific other national security councils can provide us some insights, and I think they kind of point out to 3 common problems in decision making in national security councils. One is individual biases or beliefs, groupthink, and unintended past dependencies. So the new government should consider the insights of this research to avoid these kind of problems. However, from my perspective, what is really more important is to create some institutional element that facilitate innovation. So the real question is, how can Germany come up with what British scholars call a big idea? Okay, let's take a look on businesses. Such as businesses have to reinvent themselves to survive in a free market, states have to think ahead of rivals in the international system. So I think, or I hope, that research can provide some insights to help the new government to come up with institutional solutions. So my second argument is that the process of developing a security strategy is not only focused on creating such a written document or a strategic guide. The process itself has a purpose. So the process itself kind of can help to shape a common strategic culture between different departments and agencies. And it also can improve interagency cooperation or coordination in practice. So when designing the new National Security Council, I think or hope that the new government embraces and facilitates this function of a national security strategy. And I think here different research fields like organization theory, historical institutionalism or new institutionalism, approaches on bureaucratic politics can help and give some advice how to design a new security council. Which brings me to my last argument. Third, to guarantee that a strategy really helps to achieve specific ends, I think the new National Security Council needs authority to monitor the implementation of the strategy. So this is really important, not only to create accountability, but or to put pressure on decision makers and bureaucracy, but also for adaptation. So we now live in a world where the international environment is constantly changing. So we need to adapt constantly to this new environment or new strategic situations. And the National Security Council needs institutions that are flexible enough to adapt to these kind of situations. And I make like advertisement for science, but here different fields like public management, research on government and accountability, but also research on public opinion can help to come up with good solutions. So to kind of summarize my argument, strategy development should be not just understand as producing a written document or a strategic guide, but comprises various functions during the development process itself and its implementation. So all these functions should be considered when designing the National Security Council, in particular because all the different functions, from my perspective, reinforce each other. So it makes sense to consider all these functions. So social scientists can provide new ideas, concepts, empirical evidence, and methods, and help the German government to come and find new solutions. However, I want to conclude with a word of self-criticism. I think that German political science and international relations have neglected strategic questions and issues for most part. Strategic studies in the German political science community are only a small part. Marina is one of it. And thank you very much for this kind of event. So I would argue, and I think the other panelists agree, I hope so, that the German political science had different turns in the past. The normative turn, a constructive turn. I think we need now a strategic turn. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Thomas and Holger. You're indeed kind of preaching to the choir here. But I once more want to congratulate you on this incredibly important work. I was very worried that when this national security strategy first got published, that, everybody would just for a minute, pay some attention and then put it in a drawer and then was the end of it, right? But you really picked up this document and also approached me and others and said, let's use this, right? This is a flawed document, but still it is the start of a new era. And, I like this, this maybe strategic turn of German political science, but at least a subfield of German political science. Let's use this, let's discuss it, let's open a public debate about it, let's analyze it, and let's think through how we can do this better. And I think we have a real chance now with the new incoming government and the idea of a National Security Council and the updating of this process to have a lot of your ideas influence the new document. So I think this is really a super important effort. So thank you very much. Now we will turn to the past because, a lot of folks say Germany never had a grand strategy and, it never was able to think strategically. I think Kristina and Frank can tell us otherwise. So, Kristina, take the floor.
Yeah, so can you hear me? So going back in time, in some ways we're going back through now the 80s and 70s and even further. Let me introduce you to Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, also sort of under the premise of some things we have discussed here as part of the conference for the last couple of days, namely that on the one hand, we have now looked at this first German document of this national security strategy, but of course, if you think of the Cold War period and of even what happened beyond, we didn't have this kind of document. So how were these kind of grand policies, ideas, strategies being put forward? And I'm sort of looking also at this question in that case of leadership. So in the absence of a document, what can we say about leadership, transformative leadership? A leader with strategic thought. A leader, a chancellor who in the German context uses his Richtlinien competence, really sort of driving the foreign security and defense policies, and perhaps even larger. Not forgetting, of course, that in Germany the chancellors always work within a coalition, and at the two chancellors I'm looking at, although I'm perhaps focusing in my formal part more on Schmidt, and then in the Q&A I can say more on Kohl. Both had Genscher as a foreign minister and therefore quite a sort of strong counterpart, perhaps with slightly different perspectives. But what I also want to highlight is that the chancellors I'm looking at, they functioned in the case of divided Germany in a semi-sovereign West Germany, a country without nuclear weapons, a country whose policies up to a point were, of course, curtailed precisely because of that status, namely in particular that anything related to the German question had to be dealt with the victor powers. So that's sort of always hovering in the background. So what can a chancellor do in a situation, in a legal situation and political situation in that bipolarity? What are his freedoms? And what are his freedoms in terms of shaping policy when we think that strategic thinking or a strategy has a lot to do with how to make that country secure? So what can we say? I mean, Schmidt, interesting, 1974, comes into power at a time of deep crisis, global crisis, collapse of the Bretton Woods system, deep economic crisis in all the open societies and the global economy. And there's always this question when you pursue strategy, do you pursue a particular strategy in response to a shock? Or do you pursue a strategy also on your own volition because you may have some thoughts? And that's where Schmidt is interesting because, first of all, he becomes chancellor in the aftermath of the Guillaume affair. And so in that sense, unexpectedly. So already that's, you have to respond to that situation by being put into this position. And then because the global international system is at such a crisis point, especially from a Western perspective. And Schmidt said something very interesting when it now comes to speeches. And I'm using speeches to show you what we discussed also in this conference as a sort of declaratory policy, right? So when in the absence of a strategy paper, how do you communicate to your electorate? How do you communicate at home and to the world your views? And I'm now not talking about vision. Schmidt hated that word vision, but we talk now about some sort of strategic aspects. So first I want to focus on Schmidt as an intellectual, somebody with intellectual hinterland, in particular the economy. That is also the crisis he comes into in this Cold War context. And he said that economic stability could not be separated from military security because those together are the foundations of peace. And he came to this as a trained economist and as somebody who had held the positions of finance minister and defense minister under the Brandt government. So he came also with political experience to this job. He said that as a chancellor, he wanted to concentrate what is essential and to achieve what is possible. So it's a bit about the art of the possible. And he did this against sort of his own notion of, how do we want to operate? What kind of world do we want to operate in? He believed in cooperation and interdependence in this sort of wider global context. And he worried that world economic stagnation and a inward-looking drive, also in the Western societies, not just when you looked at Soviet Union and China, a turn towards more autarkic behavior, a turn to protectionist trade, and thereby also, deepening the recession, that would make everything worse because there was the fear in his mind that if we go down that route, then that's bad for the democratic structures. And that is bad for the democratic structures, in particular in these industrial societies, and that democracy actually would break up. And of course, in a Cold War context, that also would be sort of the end of the Western world, if you so want, on a grander scale. So he said the grave economic situation, which is of course tied up also with the oil crisis, in other words, energy security, again, something that rings a bell today, is really posing a grave danger. And we need to do something about it. We need to stabilize the situation, and we need to do so for world peace. So economics always connected with security. And he wanted to do this in political unity in Europe, but in partnership with the United States. So that's where you also have that Euro-Atlantic alliance, not just through NATO per se, but also in the sort of wider picture. And what did he say about his view of foreign policy in this? And that's where I want to quote. He said, foreign policy today is not just a specialist discipline for well-dressed, white-bearded, well-behaved diplomats. No, foreign policy is also world economic policy, world material policy, world agricultural policy, world monetary policy, and world security policy, right? Because we live in a universal system of mutual dependence. Whether we want it or not, we cannot get away with it. In other words, if we think about foreign and security policy, we have to think about the whole range. And in some ways, however difficult it is to grasp that sort of Kanzler mit Weltblick, if you so want, and Weitblick, is in some ways also, of course, reflected in the strategy that we are talking about in the very present. You see that if we think about security, peace, and prosperity at large, we have to think of so many different things, raw materials, climate change, even at this present time. So what was his legacy in that respect, institutionally, and that's where you see institution building did matter, was, for example, the creation of the G7, of the leading industrialist states, trying to resolve, they had all different kinds of economic policies, somehow bring together. You have a debating forum, however unwieldy this forum may have been, to come up with solutions to this world recession. And that's where I want to leave the economy for now and turn to the defense intellectual. Because we could say he was trained as an economist and he saw these necessities, how to respond, but his real passion lay somewhere completely different, namely in defense and security policies. Now, coming out of the shadow of Brandt, and this is Ostpolitik, here's something very interesting. He was never, in that sense, a competitor with Brandt over Ostpolitik. Brandt had a sort of more idealized vision what he wanted to achieve in relations with the Soviet Union and the DDR. But Schmidt thought about Ostpolitik in different ways. He thought about Ostpolitik as an emerging tripolarity, perhaps with America, Soviet Union, and China. He had a very early interest in China with view to if there is an economic opening, what this may mean over the long term. He wasn't entirely sure, but he felt that China will be important one day. He thought about Osthandelspolitik, the importance of the trade, and he thought about the Soviet geopolitical power, always through the lens of the balance of power. Why did I say defense intellectual? Because he was in close correspondence, for example, with Henry Kissinger over trying to explain from his perspective to the German populace what did this Cold War and the nuclear balance mean. And he wrote 2 books, Verteidigung und Vergeltung in 1961 and Strategie des Gleichgewichts in 1969. And this sort of intellectual, putting the mind with a pen on paper, gave him, of course, a much wider audience because everybody could buy these books. And it gave him the respect internationally also with the victor powers, whether it's the Soviet Union, but in particular in the West with British, French, and American intellectual and nuclear strategy thinking circles, that here is a German chancellor who can think about these big questions. And why do I mention this? Because this respect was really important as the Cold War began to unravel from détente. Because Schmidt had also said from the German perspective and from NATO's perspective, even if we get these economic problems under control, we have to always remain a bit suspicious what's going on with the Soviet Union, and we have to shore up our own position. And that is where his sort of true passion lay. We have to work from this balance of power, from this equilibrium of power, and we cannot fall behind. But West Germany could not do anything on its own, unlike today as a sovereign state. So we can ask, why are we building not certain missiles? We had these debates this morning. Well, West Germany could not. But Schmidt had a way of rallying, in particular the British, French, and Americans, around a table where he could join. This is, for example, the Guadeloupe Summit in 1979, where West Germany managed to sit at the top table with the nuclear powers to find a response to the Soviet buildup of SS-20s. And you have to think of this also against the background that the Soviets were in part financing, the communists and certain segments on the very left amongst the pacifists. So you have this big popular upheaval against any Nachrüstung. When Schmidt was driving this dual track, if the Soviets do not get rid of their SS-20s, the West needs to have a response which it currently doesn't have, but Germany can't do it because of its curtailed situation. He has to rally the Western powers, and in particular the Americans, to do so. And that is sort of at the root of that NATO dual-track decision. But as you know, he fell over this politically within his own party, with view to the pacifists and also, the Green movement and the emergence of the Green Party. And yet, ironically, when he gets ousted from government, also when his coalition partner Genscher switches, Kohl is the one who pushes through the cruise missile and Pershing II decision, which is also at the heart of when we later get to the INF agreements and the diffusing of the Cold War. So this Nachrüstung was actually very important, and it was a legacy of Schmidt through this dual-track position that he had pressed within NATO, a German defense intellectual as chancellor who got NATO to do something, although technically he wasn't in that power political position. And where I want to end is that where this comes to bear fruit is when we come later under Chancellor Kohl to the historic opportune moment when a chancellor who didn't work as an intellectual but more out of instinct has the chance to shape this unification diplomacy. Germany had already emancipated itself through the Schmidt chancellorship, through what I have just described, through this strategic thinking, into a position that when you then have these options on the table in 1989, 1990, you see how we go from 1+3, Germany with the Western victor powers, to 2+4, where the two Germanys together with the four victor powers, rather than having a big peace conference, come to resolve, to have that final settlement of the German question as we move out of the Cold War. And that's where I will end because I'm already out of time. Thank you.
Fascinating, Kristina. And I think what is so important, and also for all of us in the room, and also for Holger and Thomas, that how much we can learn actually from Germany's past, right? And I think this is maybe one of the things that is still a little bit missing in your analysis, is because we always, now I hear very often, Germany can't propose this and can't do this, and most of the ideas, they get generated at NATO or, like in the United States or somewhere else, right? And we forget that under much dire circumstances, when Germany was theoretically not a sovereign state, we had active strategic thinking here, right? And like an enormous creativity where the German chancellor was actually directing American foreign policy, defense policy. And I think Frank will also tell us a little bit about this, the German ability to somehow influence American decision-making, and of course, vice versa. So take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, Marina. And I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to talk about how the Americans thought about these set of issues. And obviously, we're in an extraordinary moment, critical and consequential grand strategic choices for Germany. Right? Obvious Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the rise of China, the planetary issues. But one of the things I'm going to suggest right now is perhaps the most important variable in any future German grand strategy is a variable that's very difficult to talk about, and it's the role, the movement, the behavior, and the temperament of the United States. In other words, Germany faces the reverse of what I'm going to talk about and what Kristina talked about. When America had the German question, Germany now has the America question. And what do we mean when we call something a question? Something is a question when it appears both intractable and politically sensitive. America's chaotic behavior certainly falls into that category. It's very sensitive, very difficult, and is going to require extraordinarily innovative thinking for any German grand strategy moving forward. The first thing that you're going to have to wrestle with is Donald Trump and his administration a consequence, a cause, or an accelerant to other forces of disorder in the world? And this is going to be a very, very difficult question, a very controversial exploration. But one of the things I thought I would do today is to talk about when the United States, the shoe was on the other foot, had to deal with a problem that seemed equally as intractable and equally as politically sensitive, the German question, with some lessons for how to sort of think creatively about how to deal with these hard problems. Now, we have a tendency to think when we look at American grand strategy during the Cold War that George Kennan came up with this containment doctrine in 1946 and 47, and in this kind of John Lewis Gaddis way, this was American grand strategy till the end of the Cold War, and successfully was led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And I think if you actually do look at the documents, this is actually completely misplaced. By the early 1950s, Kennan's containment doctrine was seen as bankrupt and broken in the United States. You had had a North Korean invasion of the South, and more consequentially, China's intervention against the United States, all at a time when Western Europe appeared exposed and vulnerable. Far more, so the United States found itself stuck in a region with its military forces in a place that was geopolitically of no consequence, while a place that was of great geopolitical consequence, Western Europe, was not defended. And the original Kennan idea of supporting economic and political transformation, while it had certain levels of success economically, had not converted itself into any meaningful defense of Western Europe. So American grand strategists were both flummoxed and terrified what to do about this in the early 50s. And at the heart of this dilemma was the political and military status of West Germany. They were keenly aware, American grand strategists, that the last time they had to deal with this, they had completely screwed it up after the First World War. This problem, which seemed insurmountable on its own, was made an order of magnitude more difficult by the nuclear question. So you had this conflation of these two issues in the early 1950s, the nuclear question and the German question. So you're sitting in the early 1950s, you're an American grand strategist, the plan Kennan had laid out for you has turned out to be useless. What do? And you have three options in front of you, and they're all terrible. There's option A, which was ironically Kennan's. He called it Plan A, and he said, well, let's cut a deal with the Soviets. Let's unify Germany, make it neutral. And then the Soviets, the Americans, could leave. This was rejected by Dean Acheson and his others. A neutral Germany unmoored to an alliance was a potential disaster for all the reasons you could imagine. Option B, the US could defend Europe by building up its conventional forces to match Soviet strength. Remember, the dilemma was that the Soviets had overwhelming conventional superiority. The Western Europeans had not rearmed. The Americans, we forget this, did not have a permanent military commitment there. They had two police divisions there, and they had sent 4 divisions there on a temporary basis right after the Korean War had broken out. But there wasn't this idea that they would be able to match the Soviets. Maybe the Americans should mobilize to match them conventionally. And this was rejected out of hand by Eisenhower, said this would lead to a garrison state, right? 90 divisions, we would lose by winning. There was no political appetite in the United States for doing this. What is option C? Well, clearly, if you want to avoid Western Europe being invaded, nuclear weapons could provide a solution, right? The British and the French had their own independent nuclear weapons. Maybe you let West Germany have their own nuclear weapons. Problem with this option, it's literally the one thing that could cause World War III. Not only would the Soviets never allow it, it was not clear that the British, French, and other Europeans would allow this. So you were left with a terrible dilemma. A deal with the Soviets was out of the question. America raising 90 divisions to go to Europe was not politically possible. You could only defend Europe if West Germany was involved, but you couldn't let the West Germans get the one weapon that would allow them to defend themselves. So from a grand strategic perspective, it seemed hopeless. But until the Americans came up with a radical, dangerous, and what turned out to be effective grand strategic solution, they would keep a certain amount of conventional forces in West Germany, but they would defend Western Europe with nuclear weapons, right? This is where American grand strategy came to rely on nuclear weapons so heavily. But even here, there was a problem, right? What would the problem be? For your grand strategy to work, West Germany had to buy into it. And if you told West Germany, hey, we're going to defend you with nuclear weapons, but we're only going to do it after West Germany has been invaded, meaning the nuclear defense of Western Europe is going to irradiate your soil and kill all your citizens. Not a great grand strategy, right? You could see the problem. Your grand strategy doesn't work unless West Germany agrees to participate in it. So what do you come up with? You have to develop a nuclear strategy, and you see this in NSC 162/2, you see this in MC 48, the NATO strategy, where you have to develop a preemptive nuclear strategy, meaning that the only way you can defend Western Europe and keep the West Germans on board and not bankrupt yourself by creating a garrison state or selling out to the Soviets was to develop a nuclear strategy that from a military perspective looked crazy. You would essentially have to preemptively strike Soviet forces as they were mobilizing. Right? Now, to an extent that we don't even fully realize, this was NATO's strategy throughout the Cold War. Right? There are still even hints of it today. This is, by the way, if you ever wonder why the U.S. has never given up no first use, this is why it is. And it's one of these things we've all watched Dr. Strangelove. You watch that movie and you say, oh, well, clearly America's weird obsession with crazy nuclear weapons has to do with crazy military people. And you say, no, it's actually a political strategy. This grand strategy, which on some levels appeared completely crazy, was the one that ended up solving all these terrible dilemmas. It was driven by political considerations. If you were going to defend Western Europe without bankrupting yourself and causing World War III, you needed to use nuclear weapons and you needed to keep the West Germans on board. This crazy military strategy was the way to do it. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit here. There were other forces and factors that went into this. And this strategy also had huge costs, right? How do you get the French to buy into this, who were not thrilled about this at all? You basically agreed to bankroll their imperial war in Southeast Asia, which the United States had thought from 45 on was incredibly foolish. But this was the price you had to pay, and we all know how that worked out. It also required fundamentally going against that point well over a century and a half of American grand strategic tradition. This military strategy weakened civilian control over the military, which was the first time, and for the first time in American history, mobilized in peacetime. Because of the nature of nuclear decision-making, it gave more grand strategic power to the president away from US Congress, and it involved more or less of a permanent peacetime alliance. All of this would have horrified the founding fathers of the United States, and a generation earlier would have been completely unthinkable. But this very unlikely option the United States stumbled upon during the Cold War was ultimately a great success. It deterred the Soviet Union. It strengthened the Western alliance. It limited nuclear proliferation. It kept West Germany fully within the alliance. And it kept the United States engaged in a commitment it might otherwise have abandoned. Why do I tell this story? Why does it matter today? It's to encourage our German friends during this crucial moment while dealing what seems like an intractable American problem. And believe me, I was worried that, I'm worried I'm going to not be able to go back to my country if this is sort of seen. If I'm talking to a German audience about how you need to come up with a strategy to deal with my country, this is actually kind of not unproblematic. Not to lose hope, right? Or to think that your grand strategic situation is hopeless. And to be bold enough to move away from traditions and former practices and to think about policy directions that may have seemed, well, only a few years ago, unthinkable.
Frank, as always, brilliant. And I want to kind of pick on you because I want to go in the reverse order. And you and me, we've talked about this before. What was the institutional, intellectual environment that made this radical thinking in the United States possible? Because I think this is very important, right? You asked Germany to think out of the box, to also kind of like look at options that the Germans have never considered, right? So really think anew, think afresh. But it requires an intellectual infrastructure, an environment, call it strategic culture, that might currently not exist here. So if you had to summarize, what type of factors enabled this radical, innovative, crazy, as you called it, thinking in the United States back then?
Desperation. I mean, we have a tendency to think that there's this long history of great American strategic culture. There was no, we did a third edition of the Makers of Modern Strategy in the Kissinger Center a couple of years ago. And the first Makers of Modern Strategy was done as this Princeton project during World War II. Edward Mead Earle was the editor of. And that was his effort during the middle of a global war, after there had previously been a war, to desperately try to build a strategic culture in the United States. And he had no problem finding the only 14 people who could write about these things. The United States had the opposite of a deep reservoir of strategic culture and strategic thinking. But these problems were so difficult that they demanded people who wouldn't otherwise think about this. And we look back on it, well, it was this great success. Kennan came up with this idea. It was a blueprint. We could modify it along the way, and it would be really, really sort of easy. You know, these strategies of containment would be super effective. And that's not how it was at all. I mean, you know, you have the whole Korea crisis. First, Dean Acheson gives a speech and says, Korea is not part of the strategic perimeter. All of a sudden, it is part of the strategic perimeter. Then we sort of defend it. We go to the Yalu River. China intervenes. I mean, there is not a lot of coherent strategic thinking here that's guiding policy. And by, let's say, early 1951, you've got the U.S. holding on for dear life in Korea. And they're looking around at the world and they think, we didn't have any strategic thinking for 5 years after the end of the Second World War because they had nuclear weapons. So we didn't have to really think about it. And it was desperation. And so obviously Germany's position is nowhere near what that position was, but the normal answers that they could have pulled out, they had to develop other ones. I'd love to say, oh yeah, it was the Wizards of Armageddon at Rand, or it was some sort of smart university. It was the fact that they were desperate for new and good ideas because the obvious answers weren't there.
Kristina, I also want to ask you, so what do you think can the Germany of 2025 learn from the Germany under Helmut Schmidt? Because interestingly, so Germany has had the Bundessicherheitsrat for a while. And if I remember correctly from my reading and from your book, Helmut Schmidt was the only one who really used that committee as a strategic vehicle to seek a strategic exchange. But maybe I'm, like you're the expert on Schmidt. But are there bits and pieces, and not, we can't replicate a Helmut Schmidt, obviously, but more of the intellectual, institutional environment that we could reconstitute today that you would say was actually helpful back in the day for Germany to take on such a strategic role?
Well, in part, of course, it hangs on the person and the person using these bodies, and also how you function in politics. I mean, we have to remember Schmidt cultivated also a sort of way of debating. He always said Politik ist Kampfsport. The better his opponent, and he loved his intellectual discussions with Franz Josef Strauss, although politically they were on completely different ends of the spectrum. And, some people said, he's like a Lehrmeister and Schmidt-Schnauz, and this is all terrible. But the point is, in some ways, he got a sort of heightened sense of refining points, the better other opponents or other discussions were. And that's why he also loved these kinds of committees like the Bundessicherheitsrat, but also over these discussions with the Baader-Meinhof terrorists, for example. When the more smart and hardcore the people around you, the more I think it drove him to pursue in an even more refined way what he tried to achieve. And I think he really tried to also see himself as a shaper of politics. He wasn't afraid also of potentially losing his job. I think that is also really important. He sort of worked out for himself what his principles were and how he tried to operate in the world and the givens that were there, make the feasible possible, but he was also willing to do so against the background that it might cost him his job. I think what we see often with leaders today is that they are more interested in holding on to their job and their personal power than necessarily thinking about the interest of the country. I think that is something that we have, although Germany got sovereign through unification, even in the aftermath of the Kohl years. I mean, we had all this talk under Schröder, die Erwachsene-Nation, and we had the Kosovo intervention, it was green-red, and, that was also unheard of, Germany, part of a military campaign and so forth. And then we get Merkel for a long time, and then we get Scholz. Actually, with these last three I mentioned, in terms of also communicating to your electorate and putting out ideas, We haven't had people of that sort of caliber who then also follow up, and less so for the interest of staying in power, of just holding a coalition together, but actually because the strategy, the idea, matters more for the interest of the country. I mean, Germans have also, of course, always grappled with this, can we stand for our national interest? And what I thought was really interesting is that when we looked at certain chancellors in the Cold War period, when West Germany was semi-sovereign, although they didn't necessarily talk about national interest, they talked about European interest or the interest in the wider Euro-Atlantic club. What was pursued, however, was a national strategy. I mean, Schmidt also talked in that Cold War context of a Kriegsvermeidungsstrategie. He talked about 1980 as he saw that as something as dangerous as 1914. When is the last time in the recent past you have heard of the word Kriegsvermeidungsstrategie? You also have to remember how complicated it has been for the German chancellors of the previous generations when they weren't, because they didn't have, let's say, experience of war. I mean, Schmidt grappled also with his past, that he was in the Wehrmacht and that he was on the Russland campaign. But, maybe that wasn't such a negative thing as in just knowing what this means. In fact, when talking with Brezhnev and talking with the American presidents, these experiences did matter. But I want to come back to this delivery of policy. I think we have also seen a communication failure. The not understanding that sometimes at very specific moments in specific places, you need to give particular speeches that then can also get picked up by the media. We are all in this Twitter storm and who has said what, and these things change every 5 minutes. Sometimes less is more. If you don't do it all the time, but then in very particular places, you make an important speech. I mentioned, for example, these early Bundestag speeches. But for example, Schmidt gave a speech at the IISS. If you think about Kohl's speeches about, how he saw that it was necessary to drive the euro forward against public opinion. At some point, you have to step out of your comfort zone and make a richtungsweisende speech that you will follow up. So we get the Zeitenwende speech, but then we have all this debate about the follow-up. If you make a speech, you have to also really pursue that strategy and have the machinery around you to follow up, which brings me back to that Bundessicherheitsrat. You then also need to understand these levers of powers to get the whole government bureaucracy and machinery to work. But that also means that you understand how the state functions, that it's not just about you alone in that leadership position, driving your own political vanities. And I think that is something we could learn from very specific chancellors in the German specific circumstances, if we look back also at history. Some people understood how you use the levers of government better than others, how to communicate better than others. And it has to do also with your personality. But, we have the power of voting, so I think also the young generation, you students here, you have to think when you vote, what kind of people are you voting for? How does that look, not just in respect to your, local electoral consideration, but what does it mean for Germany? And for 30 years, although we have been sovereign, I think Germany didn't really think about how Germany functions on a global plane. Schmidt said, we are a world economic power number 3. We are not a political power, we are politische Mittelmacht. But we can convert our economic power into more leeway, and we must not be afraid to do so if we understand our baggage of history.
Excellent, very good. Holger, you're quite ambitious when it comes to this National Security Council, because, and I cite you now from your remarks, you say, it potentially has at least 3 functions. The first one is produce this written document, so a new national security strategy. The second one is shape strategic culture, and you kind of added to this also improve coordination among the different ministries. And then the third one is to have the authority to monitor the implementation and the adaptation of the strategic document. And you know quite well, because you also attended the conference, that this requires a lot of people and B, people with very different qualities, right? So if you really want to think strategically and develop this document and implement and adapt the document, and Nina Seiloff, I think, left us, but she is the expert on these kind of steps.
These people need to be insulated. They need to be able to think strategically, long term. You need to give them a lot of free space and, kind of like isolate them from day-to-day activity. And then, like your second point here, to improve coordination and kind of try to shape strategic culture, that is the opposite, right? It's people who are in constant contact with all the ministry and really know them and talk to them all the time and have friends and colleagues and coffee, lunches, and dinners, right? Because this is kind of how you can coordinate and create a consensus. So how would you, is your proposal when you talk, and I know you guys are setting up meetings with people in the Bundestag and with the ministries, you're extremely well placed for these kind of activities. Is your idea of a really big National Security Council staff that can organize all these different tasks? Or if you probably will, soon realize that it's impossible to hire 250 new staffers or second them from the ministries, what would you then opt for if you had to go for one of these missions?
That's a really tough question. And I have to agree, the possibility that we see really, I think, a major push for a comprehensive National Security Council is really low. So just out of our stomach, I would say like maybe 10 or 20 people sitting there and working on the whole stuff of the national security. It's just the location even. I mean, the Bundeskanzleramt doesn't have the rooms right now. So this is just these kind of little small problems which already might prevent seeing a major shift. So I think what we will see definitely is my first argument. We will see, okay, I'm guessing there will be a new document. So you need people who coordinate the different resorts, the different departments. They will kind of, send their kind of ways and means to the Bundeskanzleramt, and they will coordinate how can we bring that together to a strategic document. I think this is what we will see. And with this, also the second part, to some extent, will come. So I hope that that's what Thomas and I try to introduce. So like an academic basis where people also from resorts which are not involved in strategy learn some basics, and that these kind of maybe will lead to forums where they kind of interact, exchange, and then we have some, at least a minimum of shaping a common strategic culture or understanding of the different strategic cultures in the different departments, because I think this is a major problem. When we had talks in the foreign ministry or in the defense department, we see, okay, the defense department, they have, from my perspective, often a clear understanding of how they see strategy. In other departments, they have, I wouldn't say they have no understanding, but it's not that clear what they understand and what's the purpose of a strategic document. So we will see. May 6th, the new team will enter the Bundeskanzleramt, and we can hope that there will be a major push and they see it as an opportunity to invest. And I don't think we see a really huge organization, but hopefully not just some political political advertisement. Okay, we have it now and that's it. I hope it will be more. Can I just give a brief comment to your first question, to Frank's question? It seemed like a little bit desperate hearing you. Okay, desperation is key for strategy development, or it doesn't sound like a good strategy for strategy development. May I just, maybe that was your hope that Frank would answer that, the strategic environment, more think tanks or scholars, that kind of improves it. And I hope, I'm not aware of any research on that, but there's research in the business field on clusters, for example. So Silicon Valley is a famous example that clusters of, same companies produce different advantages, labor pooling, but what's also called feeling effects. So like the innovation is in the air. It's not like the innovation is in the company, but the exchange in the evening at restaurants or whatever with just random people, which also have different ideas on the same topic. And maybe that might be also a solution for Berlin to have more like strategic thinkers, and we have these kind of feeling effects, but this is not based on empirical studies. It's, yeah, maybe also a hope of mine.
So I do want to amend my answer a little bit, because the mention of the National Security Council got me thinking about the 1947 National Security Act, which creates the National Security Council, and it got me thinking about whether or not you want a National Security Council that's coordinating between cabinets, or whether it generates its own independent grand strategic advice, and which is better. The US has definitely shifted towards NSC-centric, which was not the original purpose. But at the very least, even though it was desperation, the US did start building these institutional practices. And because of those practices, you did start developing think tanks, RAND, universities started building strategic studies programs. Many of the people who had served in World War II and came out and thought about these issues and were still interested in them. There was a climate, and the NSC system, which had been created, which led to these creation of these documents and these debates, absolutely produced far more effective grand strategic debates than you would have witnessed in the United States 25 years earlier, right? There was no process like this for the Harding administration. There was no process like this for the Hoover administration. There was no process like this for the Teddy Roosevelt administration, right? You look at how Woodrow Wilson made grand strategic decisions, and he's by himself with Colonel House, right? And so there is absolutely, after World War II, this creation and this institutionalization, whether it's right or wrong, which is better, what you should copy, but it made an enormous amount of difference in terms of generating options that would not have been possible in the US strategic environment before this was created.
So I will get to our audience in a minute, and so already, prepare your questions, and then we will also turn off the video recording, right? But Thomas, I still have you on my list. If you could design the strategy writing process, and I think you're really like the world expert now on this document, and knowing all the ins and outs, and also understanding, I think, the plumbing behind it. So if you had to design the new strategy development process, how it would look like, how would you improve the one that, that undergirded the 2023 document?
That's another extremely challenging question. And just let me pick up where Holger left us. I think what is now happening with the new administration is that much of the thought of the initial days will go into the implementation question and how the council would look like, who sits on the council, where it's located, how many chairs there are, and these kind of questions. And the strategy development will be in sort of a second thought, or not an afterthought, but sort of the second thing that people will work on, which ideally I think it should be the other way around. So we should rather design a strategy and then think about the ways of implementation, and then maybe different designs would be required for the new strategy. Unfortunately, understandably, there's a lot of pressure right now to get going, get the council implemented, get a new team in, get people trained, and then start working on the new strategy. I think on the design question, again, I think the last 2 days showed that there are lots of dilemmas involved, right? And particularly if you consider the way that the German security system is designed, it's both very fragmented. So on different levels, the Länder are very important. The central government, of course, many different ministries that are required to come in. We have this departmental principle, so the ministries are very strong, the resorts are very strong in the German system, and then again you have this this chancellery, which again sits on top of it. And I think the dilemma is that either you strongly centralize it, the whole process, so keep the team small, work on a central document, and maybe then adhere bits and pieces, get the ministries in. But then again, you need them for the implementation. So you really need to get them on board. And if you open it up a lot, like I think in the first process, the way it worked was that there was a lot of sort of back and forth with the ministries, which then ended up in this very long list of means. So I'd say probably the truth is somewhere in the middle. So you need mid-sized teams, maybe get a good way to get to start with the grant and the big idea, but then also open the room for the ministries to get in and be aware of the trade-offs that you have in the different models that you have. So unfortunately, I don't think there's one. I don't know if you knew one, but there's not one design that is optimal considering the fragmented structure that we have in our security architecture.
So we're very close to finishing the panel, and so I would like to give all of our panelists the last chance to maybe kind of address the larger question that is guiding this event. You know, is there value of grant strategy for Germany? But, you know, like also if you want to address some of the questions that were asked, like feel free to do that. So Frank, do you want to start with our
Sure,
finishing
real
round?
quickly, because I wanted to answer those two questions. I was thinking about this, both what you said about Germany, having what its grant strategy was before, and I think the best, so I'm going to contradict something I said earlier. I love arguing with myself. One, the best strategies are probably the ones that aren't just defensive in nature, but actually seek to offer a positive vision and shape the environment, right? So you don't want to just be reactive. You want to say, I have a powerful vision for a world I'd like to see happen, and this is my strategy. And the best American strategies have been like that. Which leads to the second point, to Sergei's point. There is no doubt, and you're going to probably not love me saying this, but there's no doubt that aspect of Germany's pre-February 2022 grand strategy were misplaced. They should not have relied on Russia for gas and growth. They should have been more realistic about China. They should not have been free riding on American security commitment. On the other hand, it would be just as much of a mistake to reject those elements of the European vision that actually people find quite appealing, right? If you were to get it right, you don't want to go from the arrogance of the Merkel period to this, we were completely wrong about everything, and now we've got to do a second best version of what the US does, which I would not recommend to even do the first best version of it necessarily. So offering a positive vision of those aspects of, there seems at times everyone's favorite habit now is to run down the Europeans, in particular the Germans, for all their mistakes, and there were big tactical mistakes. But we shouldn't forget the European project is this extraordinary historical success and offers a vision of the world that is far better at dealing with the planetary issues we're going to face, such as the climate challenge or public health crises that are going to come. And so finding a way to say, well, we're not going to go and pretend it's Cold War II again, which I think it would be a mistake. We're not going to free ride. We're going to protect ourselves from a Russian threat. But by the way, we have a very positive vision, and maybe we were a little arrogant about it 15 years ago, but there are elements of that that are actually quite appealing and would help us shape the environment we're in.
100%. And just very briefly, I think one of the mistakes was just that they thought this idea would spread automatically, right? There was like this automatic mechanisms of these kind of like beautiful European ideas that would take hold and stay in Europe forever and then spread globally without any real strategy behind it. And I think this is the mistake. But I 100% concur with you that a lot of things that were developed here over the last like 30 years since the end of the Cold War are fabulous, right? And they should be kept. Sorry.
Yeah, I want to perhaps come back to these issues of, what is the strategy actually doing? In some ways, it starts off with sort of beschreiben, right? It's a bit of a Bestandaufnahme. Also in the Cold War, we had these sort of Weißbücher der Bundeswehr, a Bestandaufnahme of what is actually happening. And it's a document, you ask about recipients, that is not just, of course, for the internal government, it's a public document for the public. So you get a sort of Bestandsaufnahme of what is actually the current situation. That's why it also needs updating from time to time. And it raises and brings about a sort of Erwartungshorizont. That is sort of the positive thing, to give people a sort of sense. In that sense, I like your word also with the guiding. It's not necessarily setting a particular goal and then getting completely shutters on your eyes and that's the goal we have to achieve. But, a sort of guide, these are the sort of things we need to think about. And of course, it's the first version. That is, we must also not forget, it's sort of a reactive strategy that came about. But it brings me also to this question that Beatrice asked before, thinking always about Plan B. So the strategy is something, as I said, it's for public consumption. But of course, we also have to accept, especially in a situation of war, certain things have to be classified. We can't just pipe up with everything in public and then the media jumps left, right, and center, and then it's open to manipulation and propaganda and so forth. Certain decisions have to be kept quiet and dealt with behind closed doors. And I would very much expect that in the German government as well, there's sort of all sorts of options being discussed. That's what actually, classified confidential conversation should be about. Not just driving down one particular road, but thinking about, what are the options on the table? Because what I think is much more problematic is, for example, us seeing how the Poles throw around this question of, Poland should have a nuclear weapon. And then somebody in Germany says, well, maybe the Germans should have their own nuclear weapons. And then because we have this discussion in Asia, should Japan have nuclear weapons, etc., etc. Then we get into this problem with the proliferation of a weaponry that wasn't really intended to be used, but we have to always remember it was Abschreckung, deterrent. To have that was also to have a deterrent not to use it, even if America held on to the first use. And that entailed something about nuclear signaling, which is also something that many governments, have lost a bit of a sort of sense how to use it. The Russians have used it very effectively in the last couple of years. But there has been also big discussion in Britain, what is Britain's or what is France's sort of nuclear signaling? But we have to remember, Germany in the 2+4 treaty signed up to no ABC weapons. So that discussion that we are having is in some ways fictional unless we actually consider what we have signed up to in the treaties and what it also means for these non-proliferation treaties. So we have to keep that sort of whole set in mind when the people behind closed doors are also having these kinds of conversations. So I think for the German populace, however, in this moment where there was a sense of, where is it all headed, in some ways the strategy document was good because it has given a people a sort of sense, if we really seriously think of our situation, we have to think about security in a broader sense. And that is something about educating also the populace.
Yeah, let me end on a positive note as well. Having in mind all the risks and the constraints about strategy making, I think one thing that the last 2 days showed is you can't do without strategy, right? And if that's the case, then you rather do it better than not so good, right? Of course, there are different opinions on how to get there, but I think our project, we want to show, for instance, what research could contribute to a strategy making process. And I think on a very last point is that we do live in democratic societies, right? We can take these documents, we can take them apart, we can really deconstruct them, we can criticize them, and that all of you are here, bright minds, I think is a good sign that we can start a conversation and really collectively think about where should Germany, where should other countries, where should Europe go in the future.
Holger, last but not least.
Great. I think I forgot your question, but I will just say some last words. I think that's. I think your question was: can they, or is it good to have a strategy? Or yeah.
What's the value of grand strategy?
Okay. I think that there is value if it's done correctly, if it's done right. I think this is the most important. So the good news is, if we have institutions, there are a lot of people in the different departments, in the intelligence service, and so which are really bright and sharp thinkers. And I think Germany has really good people. We always think about lawyers when you think about the part, but it's not the case. So if we get these people, the right institutions and the right environment, I think there can be really valuable security strategies for Germany. But that's a real question now, and we will see that in the next months. It doesn't take years. It will be this year. We will see, okay, how do the institutions look like, and what kind of people will address the next security strategy. So it will be really exciting times.
Yeah. Well, to echo my dear friend Frank, we are in a critical moment right now, and also what you just said, it's really not about years, it's about weeks and months that will be decisive. There's a lot of money on the table, as you know, in Germany, and I would, also just highlight what you said. Strategy can be very useful, in particular when you have the money and you need to think about how to distribute it, right? Because it's very easy to waste money. I have certainly done it in my life, and Germany can also do it. And I think in these absolutely critical moments, and there's so many resources on the table, we need to somehow do better strategy than worse strategy, right? It's not about perfect. It's not about the ideal strategy. It's just to be a little bit better than the antagonist and not to waste your resources. And I think this is our aim. And I'm also quite optimistic, and I hope you also kind of concur. In Germany, there is this group of people getting together, thinking about strategy. I feel it's much more active than it was, 4 or 5 years ago. There is a real revitalization of strategic studies, and we also get a lot of help from the United States, from Germans living abroad. So I'm also quite optimistic that we can do it better. In this spirit, we all have our grand strategic socks for you that you hopefully will wear every single day in memory of this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. And let's give our panelists a warm applause.